Take it easy. Take it easy.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. This is episode number 3 for those who are keeping track. My name is Tony, and I'm here with a good friend of mine, Nate, as usual. Last
Howdy,
time we
howdy.
talked a little bit about what's it look like walking through suffering, through some hardships in lives. We talked about some hurricanes, both literal and emotional. And, it brought us to a question that I think is gonna be really fun today because Nate, if I'm not mistaken, we have a guest with us, right?
Yes, say hey to our good buddy, Michael Schlender. Michael, say hey.
Hello. Hello and hey.
Michael!
Michael and I worked together for, what was it, Michael? Just like a year and a half, 2 years?
Yep, something like that.
Yeah, we staffed a missions Bible training school together. Michael is a Bible nerd like me. He loves Jesus, and I think with the topic today, he's going to have a lot to share. So hopefully in the future, we'll have plenty more of Michael around here.
I'm hoping so.
Yeah,
So Tony, do you
absolutely.
want to start off our topic here, or would you
Yeah,
like me to?
I think, last time and even the our very first episode for those who already went through these back to back, and you probably just heard this, yesterday or a couple of hours ago, if we're lucky. We tend to like talking about very easy questions, easy topics, things that aren't heavy at all,
Taking
and
the easy
so
approach. That's right.
this time around, when we were talking about some of those hurricanes and what that looks like in our lives and how it's different for every person, the topic of, well, what does it look like from a Christian perspective really, shines forward for us. And I think, we are all on the same page. I say we, Nate and I, and Michael as well. And I mentioned this a second ago off screen actually, that this is, from my perspective, not necessarily a Christian podcast, but make no mistake about it, it is a podcast done by Christians. And so with that being said, I think it'd only be fair for us to really discuss what does that mean? What does it mean for us to be Christians? How do we really view that? And does it have the same typical meaning that anyone has when they throw it around out there, or does it mean
Mm.
something different to us?
Yeah, and I'll start us off with a question to kind of get things rolling here, because this is a word that has definitely changed over the years. Like I feel like
Mhm.
even my understanding of it has, not just my understanding, but even the way the word is used in culture around me, I feel like has changed in the last
Yes,
couple decades. But that's
absolutely.
even more pronounced when you start looking at the way this word was used like centuries ago or millennia ago. But what is a Christian anyway? So I want to hear from Michael starting straight out the gate here, and then
Yeah.
from Tony, and then I'll add in my thoughts as well. But whenever we hear the word Christian, what is the first thing that comes to mind?
Hmm. I mean, if we're talking about the first thing that comes to mind, I guess a little picture of a guy wearing a cross on his chest is I guess, first thing that comes to mind.
Superman, Christian
Yeah,
Superman.
you can
Bible
pull
man.
apart the shirt and there's the little cross on
That's right.
there.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I think, I mean, just generally speaking, I would imagine for a lot of people, a Christian is someone that just calls themselves a Christian.
Hmm.
But clearly, I think there's a lot more to it than that. But as far as first thoughts, that's what I got.
Yeah. This is probably bad, but I think I have a negative knee-jerk reaction,
Mm.
I do too, Nate. I
like
do too.
first blush from the word. As someone that self-identifies as a Christian, this is like my dirty little secret.
Sure.
I don't say I'm a Christian to people. They're like, "Do
Yep.
you have religious beliefs?" I say, "I'm a Jesus follower," which
Yep.
can sometimes create even more confusion. But
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's because, yeah, Michael, you said it. It's like someone who says, "I am a Christian." That is what a Christian is, at least in this culture.
Yeah.
And that can, like, the ability to just self-identify as like whatever the heck you want kind of opens up the door for anyone to represent Christianity any way they want to.
Yeah, absolutely, and that representation is not where we want it to be. most of the time, right? At least that's the impression I get sometimes.
Yeah. Hey, what's your knee-jerk reaction when
Yeah,
I say, what
I'm
is
on
a
the
Christian?
same page, Nate, as much as I hate to admit it. My knee-jerk reaction goes to Sunday school. Like, "Oh,
Mm,
I'm a Christian? Oh, okay. I went to Sunday school when I was a kid too." When I was a kid, I grew up around that stuff too, but
yeah.
it's like there's this superficial feeling of, "Oh, okay, well, now that person's a Christian, I have to watch how I talk around them. I have to be careful about this. I have to do X, Y, and Z around them." Or I clam up. I no longer wanna talk to that person once I know that they're a
Yeah.
Christian. So kinda like what you said, Nate, like, when it comes up in a conversation, I can't tell you the number of times when I've had really great, genuinely deep conversations with people I know, strangers, and in between, and I because of the fact I did not attach the word Christian to my forehead, I was able to talk through so many Christian principles from my life that I feel like I never would have had the opportunity to if I wore that Christian on my head right away. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, thinking in terms of, like, the common understanding of the word or that knee-jerk reaction, first thing that comes to mind type thing. Michael, what would you say if there are common misunderstandings or common stereotypes, whether true or untrue or unfortunately true? What do you think they'd be? Common misunderstandings or stereotypes surrounding the word?
Oh boy. I mean, I think we already touched on it a little bit. There's sort of the common misunderstanding. You're a Christian if you're willing to say it, or if you grew up that way, and that's it. And then I think the common perception that's out there is that Christians like to talk a whole lot about being Christian in some cases, but they really
Mhm.
don't live anything like
Mm.
how they're supposed to. And then they try to get away with it by saying, well, no one can, or,
Mm.
like where it's all about forgiveness, baby.
Mm,
And so they get away, in a way, they have like this little get out of jail free card. And so we look like a pack of hypocrites. And I think that's a common look for Christians. We're hypocrites. And then we try to explain it away by saying like, well, everybody is. And I don't think
mhm.
it's supposed to be like that. And I don't know, a really bad taste is left in the mouth, and I think it makes sense that it tastes like crap.
Well put.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like when I'm first meeting someone and if I get even the slightest impression that the first impression that they walked away from with me was me acting like I was better than them, or I feel like I'm on a high horse and, I'm right, they're wrong. Anything that fits into that category for me, like if I pick up on that someone else is feeling that way about me, like that's a great way for me to be inside my head and to really shoot myself down, honestly. And so it's like I have such a high disdain for that kind of a situation. And so I never want to come off across that way just because I said I'm a Christian, and then automatically people may be assuming things. But like you said, Michael, they can see certain behavior and jump right away to, well, wow, I thought he said he's a Christian, but he drinks beer. Oh man, I thought he said he's a Christian, but he said a cuss word earlier. Oh man, things
Mhm.
like that are very superficial. I think that's what I'm getting at, Nate, is the superficial impression that the word Christian gives, to me at least, and what I feel like it gives to non-Christians, that is a very powerful message. And I push back against that superficial label of Christianity so hard.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this, just as like you guys can take a dart throw at this one, a blindfolded dart throw at this one. But if you were to take a shot in the dark at guessing how many adults in this nation identify as Christian, what
Mm.
would be the percentage you'd land at?
I would say for me, if I had to dart it out there like that, I would say 60%.
I was
Michael?
Yeah, I was thinking roughly the same thing, I think. I think in maybe decades, like a decade ago, that number would have been something closer to like 70, 75%. But I think that number has been dropping. So probably like 60, 65%.
That's pretty darn good, guys. Yeah. As of 2023,
Mm.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Barna Group, but they're a group that does a lot of this kind of stuff, a lot of surveys and polls, and trying to get to the bottom of like um, Christians and identifying and roles and practices and like lifestyle and stuff like that. But as of 2023, that number was 63%.
Yeah.
Well,
In the USA. So you guys are right there. And Michael, you're also spot on, because when I first started getting into the Barna groups, like into their tracking of this statistic, which was right at around a decade ago, that number was closer to 74%. So it's falling. Like it's absolutely
absolutely.
falling. But I would say that number feels way too high. Like if you go out into just go hang out at the mall somewhere, like does it feel like the majority of people around you are Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be curious, this is not a number to easily be identified, but out of that 60%, what percentage, what majority are Christian because they were raised Christian?
Yeah.
And
Or
that's what they know.
yeah. And then like it's like what is the qualifier for when you identify as Christian? Because there seems to be a
Exactly.
lot. Like there are people who were baptized
Mhm.
at birth who identify
Call
as
them
Christian
Christian.
because they were baptized as birth or at
Yep.
birth. There are people who are Christian because, like you said, they were raised in a Christian household. There are people who identify as Christian because they go to church on the usual suspect weekends, like Christmas and Easter, to make grandma happy, you know?
Mm.
And there are other Christians who prayed a prayer at one point, or
Mhm.
other Christians who, what that means for them is they go to church once a week. And that is
Mhm.
like, that's the extent of it. And then there's other people who are like, I do everything in my power to like live like Jesus. So it's like, where is the line? Is it more about a belief? Is it more about a behavior? Is it about self identity? Is it about membership? This is the stuff that I think you have to start thinking about if you try to define this word.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask this. Uh, if probably if I were to say, do you guys think that the modern definition of Christian and like the smorgasbord of definitions that we now have for Christian, which I just kind of laid out, if I were to ask if you guys think that it's different now, the word or the concept or the movement is viewed as different now than it was when it first started, that's kind of a freebie. I think you guys would both say yes for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah.
But I'll ask this because this is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. What are the effects of watering down a movement?
Well,
Like if you take a thing that is about a movement, it's about doing something, and then you water down the meaning of the word that identifies the movement, such that many people can self-identify as that thing without necessarily being lined up with what the thing originally was. Like what is going to be the effect or the effects of that,
yeah.
and how do
Yeah.
we see that play out in culture around us right now?
I think that has a lot of consequences with a lot of Christian terminology, honestly. I think the word Christian in and of itself, as what you're alluding to, Nate, of course, falls victim to that, where basically it can mean one word, the word Christian can mean all kinds of things, which at the end of the day means nothing, right?
Yeah.
The idea that,
If
well, if
everyone's
everyone,
Christian, no
yeah,
one will be.
exactly, right? But and like I can't tell you the number of times when I've had the opportunity to have some biblical studies myself, when I've really dived deep into a lot of the Christian terms and vocabulary that just when you go through Sunday school as a kid, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And all of a sudden you start talking about words like love and words like holy and other things that to the normal person out there, it loses its weight. It loses its heaviness. The word holy, for example, is like, oh yeah, that's just it's a church thing. It's very religious, like a holy man, And it's just like, I do think that there are consequences there. I think that there's a lot of consequences in the concept that you don't see what's not there. You don't know what you don't know, right? And so when you take away the weight of what something used to be, you have no clue what you're missing because it's no longer in front of you. And so it's like a double. Both sides of it sucks because not only does it have a consequence, but you don't realize that you are enduring that consequence because it's so vague and vast now. Does that make sense, Michael?
But basically, it's like, what are the ways that we see and experience? Like, what are the ways this society and our culture experiences the watering down of Christianity, of this word Christianity? Like, what have been the ripple effects?
Oh boy. Well, I think my first thought is, if you want to talk about it being watered down, you have to talk about it when it was watered up, I guess. So yeah, I'm thinking of Acts, and there's like a powerful spiritual reality that's occurring. The Holy Spirit's doing stuff. And along with that, there's also like a powerful caring community movement. People are being extremely generous. They're taking care of each other. They're taking care of widows and orphans and the very, very poor and the very, very ill, and so on and so on and so forth. And I think you can, if you're talking about watering that down, you remove sort of I guess the spirit, and you've got really a whole lot of nothing. All you have is hot air. And then you also just talk about sort of a group of people who will talk about like how nice it is to be generous, but aren't generous, or how nice it is, how wonderful Jesus is for healing, but they're not interested in taking care of anybody. The Lord cares for the poor and needy, but they've never helped out a widow, or a homeless person. They ignore the homeless because they're gross, things like that. And so I look at, I think a lot of like, what's the impact of that in our current society culture? And again, we've talked about it. Christians are mostly just like a sanctimonious pack of like annoying people who are going to talk your ear off, but they don't live what they've said. And so, yes, Mr. Christian guy, you have to do good. You're not putting any soup in a bowl for the homeless. I think that's why the broad culture seems like it's mostly annoyed and has a sense of distaste with a lot of Christianity, because we've become pushy with none of like, we've become pushy with our beliefs, but weak on actually doing what we believe.
Yeah. Nate, I'm definitely curious your perspective on it. You have something in mind that you feel like has been a consequence of this watering down?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it in my mind. There's a lot. If somebody just like, if they identify as a Christian, or via heritage, or via baptism, or via having prayed a prayer at a summer camp or something, like each of those can lead you to a different sort of identifying as Christian, but ultimately they end up in the same barrel, which is not doing anything. And even people who are like gung-ho Christians, there's been this big movement in Protestantism, maybe especially over the last 150 years or so, moving the purpose of Christianity, and like the conversation that's adjacent to this one is, what is salvation? Like, what does it mean to be saved? But moving the definition of salvation and moving the purpose of the gospel to focus around dying and going to a good place instead of going to a bad place,
Oh, yeah.
which is like, there's just enough truth in that to miss the point if you make the entire thing about that.
Absolutely.
But either way, the result is that you have a Christianity that doesn't do anything. It becomes about a belief or about an individual experience rather than a lifestyle. And so I that kind of like blends right over into like the big question here, which is if Christianity has lost a big part of its meaning, or if it's become many shades of something that none of those shades really capture the intended, like what this movement was supposed to be about, then what is it? Like, I asked you guys what you think when you hear the word Christian and what some common misunderstandings and stereotypes are and that sort of thing. But if I were to ask you in your own words what it actually means to be a Christian, like what the word is intended to mean, and then why you think that, because in the end we can have our opinions, but hopefully our opinions are based in something more than just what we feel.
Mhm.
If I were to ask that question, that's what I want to hear from you next.
Yeah, Michael, definitely curious to your thoughts there.
Yeah, I'll boil it down. I can get a
Yes,
little
sir.
wordy. Well, what is a Christian, Michael?
What is a Christian?
Yeah.
If I was trying to boil it down the best I can, I would maybe put it as there's a lordship component to it. Jesus is your Lord. That includes your trust and obedience. I think the fact that a lot of obedience is missing is a big part of why Christians are looked at the way that they're looked at these days. And I think a big part of it as well, I'd use the word, I guess, participation. And that participation is both, with the divine, it's having that relationship with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but it's also that participation in the community, which is, when you come to Christian theology, you're talking about Christ's body. So it's all kind of mixed up in each other a bit.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, man. I think
Yeah.
it's hard to
There's
smush it. It's really multifaceted.
Yeah. There's a
Very
reason
easy
why it has
question there, Michael.
become big. That's why, yeah, we got to take the easy approach. Yeah, you said the word lordship, and I immediately cringed.
Mm.
And I think it's like the evangelical background in me, the church background in me, where there's like a dirty list of words that people say all the time in a church context that just nobody knows what they're talking about. They're just like vaguely throwing ideas out. And Christian, salvation, holy, and lordship is right at the top of the list.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus is Lord, but really, as long as you pray this prayer, the Jesus is Lord is a nice little bonus in terms of whatever that means. Like, it's okay, just do your best to make Jesus Lord, but ultimately you're going to die and go to a good place because you prayed this special prayer. You followed the Romans road because the book of Romans has no other point than to teach you a magic prayer. I don't know what all those other chapters were all about. Who knows? But it
Not
gave
a
me the
big deal.
key. It gave me the key to go to heaven when I die. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I find that when I roll up, because those of you listening that aren't familiar with this, I travel to a lot of different places and I teach in Bible schools and stuff like that. And I find that I have to be hyper intentional, even with people who are like in a Bible school, to define my terms.
Yes. Yes.
Because whether it's the word Christian or salvation or lordship or whatever else, people they don't know what's what. Or if they're vague on it, nobody wants to clarify it. It's almost like we expect things to have vague meanings with the way they're used. Like, oh, that means something? That actually means something tangible and direct? So with the idea, because you mentioned community, you mentioned like connection with the other people who are Christian in like a meaningful sense of the word. You mentioned lordship and obedience. Let me ask it this way. If you are in like a first, second gen, if you're a first, second gen Christian, What does it mean? What did it mean 2,000 years ago to be a Christian? How did they understand the term? And how does their understanding differ than how we confuse it?
Yeah, 'cause correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but Jesus was Christian.
I guess he was as Christ-like as they come, but
The most Christ-like.
yeah, I mean, I guess when it comes to like your first and second generation of Christians, again, if you want to talk about the very, very first ones, you go back to Acts again.
Yeah.
The thing that's interesting with them is that you start with the apostles slash disciples. They already had a little community and they were doing community stuff. Then you have Pentecost, and then like a couple thousand people like become they enter.
Trying to find the word.
Yeah, it's like they become Christians, but they weren't
Become
called that.
Mm.
Christian. Yeah.
But I don't know, they trust that Jesus was who he said he was.
Yeah. That's a
All that
big
kind of good stuff. They received the Holy Spirit. They joined the community. They got baptized.
Yeah.
All of this kind of stuff, and they confessed Jesus as Lord in the midst of a bunch of, well, in their case in Jerusalem, where the chief Christian, Jesus, just got killed.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And
and
there's
then
only one Lord in that part of the world, and his name is Caesar.
Caesar.
Yeah.
And he will hang you on a piece of wood if you say someone
Yeah.
else's.
And I know we're talking about the history of things. I personally find church history fascinating. I really do. I think there's a lot of interesting things in church history, in that sphere of knowledge that gets glossed over, and people just don't see the practical uses of understanding what we went through, and not
Yeah.
just as a church, just history in general. So don't even really start on the big picture, but on the micro, it's like what you said. It's like there was a Lord back then, and if his name was not Jesus, and he was pissed at all these little guys who started this cult, and all of a sudden was messing up all of his finances, like messing
Mm.
up all the control and authority he has. But it wasn't just Caesar, right? Like these early Christians, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, the joke with Jesus being a Christian, of course, Jesus was a Jew, right? And
Mhm.
so not only were these people who are making this radical choice to believe something to an outsider's point of view is crazy, they not only had to worry about Caesar and Rome and the Italians, but they had to worry about their fellow people that they've known their entire lives, the other Jews, right? What does that look like to you, Michael?
I mean, you're absolutely right. They experienced immediate trouble because you want to say that Jesus is Lord. Well, Yahweh is Lord, and what are you doing? It's why you get Paul's slash Saul's story, and everyone was supporting him, going around dragging so-called Christians by their hair back to Jerusalem to kick the crap out of them and deal with them. And so there's an element to this, again, like talking about lordship seems like it's such a vague word, and also somehow like a cringy word in our like modern sense of it, where we're at right now in our like American Christian culture. For them, it'll get you killed a couple different ways from a couple different groups.
Yeah.
That's right.
To say that, you're saying I'm not going to live the way that Caesar wants me to. And in
Mhm.
fact, I'm also going to live differently than I'm willing to drop some of the things from my Jewish identity too. And no matter how you sliced it, you got a bunch of angry people at you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that hardship, that hardship of the first and second generation Christians, and Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where my mind goes when you bring this up. That's a hardship that none of us know. Like
Right.
none of us can fathom that, and not just coming from one direction, but just from everywhere. Literally the well-being of you and your loved ones, right? Not just like sure there's a lot of single guys, single women, I imagine, but it's like if you had a family and you were asked to, really make a declaration in front of all these people who you've grown up with your entire life following these very, I don't know if rigid's the right word, but these very strong traditions. And there's a reason why they had these traditions, right? And and then you're going to not only put your own safety and your own well-being on the line, but that of your families as well, just to say, "Yeah, you know what? I actually believe what you what you think is a crazy guy over here. I actually do think he's saying the truth, to the point that I am willing to admit that despite what the consequences may be," going back to,
Yeah.
the weight of things and possible consequences. And so I think that all ties in where, in the modern day, dealing with that level of a consequence, a direct and immediate consequence, it's not something that we ever have to endure, for better or for worse. You know, Nate?
Yeah. So, yeah, fingers crossed that stays that way, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, at least,
There's hope.
in our culture, American
Yeah.
culture. Yeah.
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 Well, pop quiz then, and I'm pretty confident you guys know the answer to this pop quiz. But where does the word Christian show up in the Bible for the first
Mhm.
time?
Michael, you're more the biblical academic, so if there's any one of the 3 of us that has a greater percentage, it'd be you, so I'm gonna go ahead and just jump right away and show my foolishness, right? But my assumption is it's not in the Bible at all. That's my guess.
Oh, okay. Michael?
I believe it's in the book of Acts. I think they mention it when they're in Antioch.
That is correct.
There
It
you
is in
go.
the Bible, Tony, 3
'Cause I know
times.
Christ-like is the translation to some degree, so I probably did know
It's
years
similar,
ago.
yeah. Christianos, which is like in Greek, if you've got that anos thing
Yeah.
after, it means like of the house of. So
Love it.
if
Mhm.
you were like of the house of Julius Caesar, you'd be a Julianos. You're like someone who's allied with him, basically, like of the
Mhm.
association with him. But yeah, Michael, you are right. It's in Antioch, in Syrian Antioch, which was the third biggest city in the Roman Empire at the time. And it showed up, as is fairly common knowledge, as a nickname,
Yeah.
basically, for this movement. And so the movement already had at least 2 different distinct ways of being referred to, this Jesus movement thing in the first century. It was called the Way, which I love.
Yeah,
I
that's a good
I'm
one.
I'm not the only one trying to reclaim that term. John Mark Comer is doing a killer job in like propagating that the usage of that term.
Yeah.
But in Acts chapter 11 verse 26, it says it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. So that's where the word pops up for the very first time. It's very clearly like a nickname. And whenever I'm having this conversation, I always say, like, okay, guys, like whatever class I'm talking to, whatever group I'm talking to, like define the word Christian for me, and you get all kinds of shades of meaning. And then I ask them if it's in the Bible, and you get different opinions. And then we look at Acts 11:26, how the disciples were given the nickname Christian, effectively. So it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, which came first, the disciple or the Christian? Clearly, the disciple came first, and Christian
That's
was a
great.
nickname. So then it's like some basic logic puzzle. It's like, if you are a disciple of Jesus, are you a Christian? It's like, well, yes. Like, that's the nickname. So flip it around then. If you are a Christian, are you also a disciple? Then it becomes more uncomfortable, because not everybody associates being a disciple, like whatever that means exactly, which might be an entirely different conversation, like getting into some of the original language, whether it's in the Greek or the Hebrew words that were used at the time. But whatever your understanding of the word disciple, most people don't associate being a disciple as being the core thing,
Mm,
and being a Christian as a nickname for the core thing. I think typically it looks something more like, I'm a Christian because of whatever reasons, whatever like peripheral reason, like I was baptized, or I go to church occasionally, or I was raised in a Christian household. And then the disciples are like the really hardcore ones, like the ones who take it really seriously. And it's like an
Yeah.
optional, like weirdo, like, well, they're the they're the extremists. Like they're the guys
Yeah,
who take.
I'm a Christian, but I'm not like that kind of Christian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and to be fair, there are some weird extremist Christians out there. That's not what I'm saying that there
Absolutely.
aren't. But the idea of like discipleship, whatever that means exactly, being optional in the Bible, this is not a thing. Like there's
Mm.
no such thing as like I'm a Christian on a very casual level. It's like you're a disciple or you aren't a Christian from a
Yeah,
New
and
Testament perspective.
I think that is a level of once more the heaviness and the weight of that. That is a consequence of watering down a lot of these terms in our culture and our society, and at the very least, our generations and those around the generations around us. You that weight's not there. We don't see that. Yeah, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I go to church. Yeah, I do this. Yeah, I don't do that. But an understanding that there is a person, an historical person who lived a certain way, and I am trying to live my life the same way that person lived. Like that when you say disciple, that's where my mind goes to. That behavior that I just described. I know if I'm not mistaken, you also mentioned, they had different words for it. Wasn't one of them like Talmahine, or I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I'm sure.
Talmud, yeah,
Talmud. Yeah.
Talmud.
In my understanding from that, and once more, this, you two are definitely far more biblically versed than I am. But what stuck with me as a principle is this, going back to the Jewish people that I brought up, right? This was a Jewish thing. This was like, is and how they still was and is how they still are, where basically you have a teacher who you has students, and these students, they're not just in a classroom like we think of traditional education. They're following this teacher everywhere he goes, and they see everything he does and how he interacts and what he says. And their whole goal is to imitate and be that teacher. And that's a Jewish tradition from my understanding. And I think, however that translates to Christianity, like I think that's so key for me, at least well, on an internal and an external level, right? Because it's not just do what this person says and stay what this person says, but truly like think like them, approach situations like that person. I think it's a beautiful picture that, this Jewish tradition of trying to become like my teacher, trying to become like my rabbi. Like I think that's such a heavy thing that the Jewish people still have today that I wish that Christianity had more of.
I asked earlier, and I want to just hear your thoughts here, Michael specifically. I asked earlier, with the modern understanding of this word, is it like some people where it's like it's more about a belief? Some people it's more about an individual experience. Some people being a Christian is about a lifestyle, or it's about behavior. Michael, with that in mind, because I don't think we want to spend like a few hours deep diving into the word discipleship, but
Yeah.
with that in mind, what is the balance from like a biblical first century perspective and how it should look today? What is the balance between, is it a belief? Is it an experience? Is it a behavior thing? With that in mind, what does it mean to be Christian?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're, again, looking at Acts and what it seemed like it was for them, I guess it feels like a bit of a cop-out answer, but it is a balanced answer of all of that. It was a belief that they had. They're not going to do anything unless they have a belief, a certain degree of trust / faith that Jesus Christ has done something, and he is Messiah / Savior / King of all things. He is the Lord. So it is a belief, But it is also there's also this personal experience, like they received Holy Spirit. Stuff was going on. It is a lifestyle. It's an entire community that needed to be so tight knit that they referred to each other like family. And they needed that because in their case, they probably got booted out of their families right quick.
Mm.
I have some friends that I work with in Bangladesh, and they experience that in a Muslim background. As soon as they become Christian, that's it. Their
Yeah.
family kicks them out. They're done.
Oh, man.
No contact. They don't want any of that impurity seeping in. That's dangerous, blasphemous stuff.
Yeah.
And so they're out. But then how do they, like, they're young. How are they supposed to keep going to school or eat?
Yeah.
Who's taking care of them? Well, they have to take care of each other. So it's lifestyle, but it's family. It's why they call each other brother and sister and so on and so forth. And there's behavior to it that's included. There's all of that love and generosity, and it cuts across all lines of the time, whether you're Gentile, Jew, barbarian, whatever you came from, whatever your gender was, so on and so forth, yada yada yada. So it includes all of that. And where I today see all of those things in play is where I've seen the healthiest expression of Christianity.
Mm.
And oftentimes it is under a tremendous amount of suffering and difficulty. Like, again, like I was saying, they understand is Christian. They're trying to be kind to the lowly. They're trying to help out people who are sick. They're trying to tell people that Jesus is the Lord, and then they get tied to trees and beaten for daring to do that. Whether they're in a Hindu town or they're in a Muslim town, they're not appreciated for that. But they live in community. They take care of each other. They raise money and they work and they try to put each other through school if they're young. They meet often. Like modern day Western Christians, I think, get so annoyed if they have to do anything longer than an hour one day a week. But how are they supposed to be anything like a disciple with 1 hour a week? And they're not really learning to walk in any particular way.
Yeah.
But these guys are,
Yeah, it's a whole nother topic, and I hear what you're saying, Michael, and I completely agree with the majority of it. But like you said, like how can you expect to grow in anything in life if you're only doing it 1 hour a week, right?
Yeah.
Nate and I touched on this a little bit in our first episode, just using the analogy of the gym and our physical growth, and it's like, sure, you can go to the gym once a week, but your real results in anything is going to be, more than once a week, more than twice a week, sometimes, and then just the concept that, this isn't a gym that we're talking about, this isn't just physical well-being that we're talking about, even though a lot of these people that you described that you've seen, they are in a place where their physical well-being is threatened. But, it's the day-to-day emotional well-being. It's the really understanding what it looks like on a daily basis, not just that 1 hour on a Sunday. I think that's so easy. That another consequence, Nate, that you mentioned earlier now of having things being watered down is you lose how important just having 1 hour a week, that doesn't do anything,
Yeah.
You lose sight of it.
Yeah, I think it's like what both you guys said. That idea of the balance between experience and between lifestyle and behavior. I mean, it's all clearly just reading the Bible, reading about these first generation followers of Jesus, disciples, because disciples a fancy way of like saying apprentice of Jesus, like learning how to live the life that Jesus taught us how to live, and then modeled for us through his own lifestyle. But it's clearly like there's an experience, there's a moment where you say, I am going to trust you and your vision for how to be human above any other vision for how to be human. there's clearly belief attached to it, which is like, I believe that you are the answer. I believe that this is the true picture of humanity. I believe what you're saying is true. I believe you are the fulfillment of everything like history has been waiting for. And then there's the actual doing part. And I think if you take any of those elements out, then if it's all about the doing stuff, it molds into this stuffy legalism really fast.
Absolutely.
If
Yeah.
it's all about belief, then you end up believing something and separating it from what you actually do. And you can show me your faith without works, and I can show you a dead faith. I can show
Yeah.
you something that doesn't matter. And then, of course, if it's all about one single experience, then it doesn't matter what you do after that experience, because you've already achieved it the moment you had the single experience. But I think Christianity lands in the place that it's in today because of hyper emphasis on one, or hyper ignorance on one or more of those three aspects of what it means to be
Yes.
a disciple, what it means to be a part of this movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So coming off of that, alluding back to what I mentioned before, where I asked you guys if you had to guess how many people self-identify as Christian in the good old US of A, how many would you guess? And you guys both landed right at around 60%, which was spot on. 63% as of February 28th, 2023. But that Barna group, and obviously trying to pinpoint or trying to gauge the level of somebody's like spiritual maturity or spirituality is like very difficult, because we can't
Mhm.
see the heart, right? We can only rely
Absolutely.
on what people will share and their honesty and whatever else. But the Barna group is pretty good about asking questions that get down to the heart of things. And
Yeah.
so
See the
in that
fruit.
in that same set of surveys where they found that roughly 63% of this nation identifies as Christian, they were able to put the number of Americans who are actively attempting to follow Jesus with their lifestyle at closer to around 4%.
Wow.
Yowza.
That that's
So
a
from a
number I would not have gotten.
well, I mean,
Mm.
I think it makes
Does make
a
sense.
crazy amount of sense, because you go into any public place and it certainly feels like you are the minority. It
Yes.
certainly feels like your vision of life and being human is in the minority. Like, it's a countercultural thing. And even in a church setting, the amount of people who are like actively and intentionally and with priority following Jesus, even among those who are regularly church attending, I would wager to guess is much lower than we might imagine,
Yeah.
because of what we were just mentioning. When you remove the need for the following Jesus part from your framework of what it means to be a Christian, then it becomes an optional thing. Like, it's a bonus, an extra crown in your, or an extra jewel in your crown in heaven when you die. And it's okay. I can live without a jewel as long as I get to heaven. I've achieved the important part. I think when
Yeah.
you remove any of those things, or hyperfixate on just belief or just experience, and remove the part where we are disciples, where we are experiencing that moment of turning and following Jesus' vision for human life and relying on him, and having the beliefs that are the foundation for the lifestyle. When we remove the doing part, the walking part, I think we, like, no surprise where we are right now, with the majority of this nation identifying as Christian, but with a small minority, a 4 to 96 kind of minority, in actually doing the thing. So my question would be, where do we go from here? There's so much of this conversation. Like, there's so many points
Yeah.
where we could go like, all right, let's open up Genesis chapter 1. Like, what is God's view? What is God's vision for humanity? And it's going all the way through the Bible. We could get into the Hebrew, we could get into the Greek, but as kind of like a 10,000-foot view of this conversation, which is kind of what it was intended to be. For you guys, if you were to say, distilling all the things we've been talking about into a, what do we need to do? What does the church need to do? What do individuals need to do? For people who are sitting here listening and saying, yes, I believe in Jesus, or I've dabbled in Christianity. Maybe I identify as Christian, but I don't I wouldn't call myself a disciple. I don't see myself as following Jesus with that kind of intentionality or priority. It's like, what do you do? What do you take away from that? What would you guys give as a key takeaway here?
Yeah, for me, absolutely. The key takeaway is it has to mean more than just a word. Like you can't just slap Christian on your forehead, but walk around with it on your head and so people can see and be okay with that. There are so many behaviors in our life where it's so easy to just say, well, that's just how I am, and we've spoken about this a few times, I feel like, but that this is just my personality. This is, I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert. This is just how I am. And I feel like that is one of the consequences of watering down the word Christianity and so many principles that are now just religious jargon. We walk around like we're Christian. We represent Christianity. But then how many times do we impact others in our lives, whenever it's intentional or not, and it does not come off as a Christian influence? It does not align with maybe Christian principles from the Bible. Or maybe it does in your mind, but there's a misunderstanding of those Christian principles, right? God knows we've seen that a ton. I try not to be victim of that myself. But at the end of the day, for me, my takeaway is we have to dwell on church history. We have to dwell on what our parents went through. We have to dwell on these things that we can learn from others, and understanding that what I am committing myself to right now by saying I'm following this path, I'm following the way, it is a big deal. It is a priority. And I need to make choices that align with that, not just have this fake little term on my forehead that can do damage to people around me.
Yeah. Yeah. Good thoughts. Michael?
Yeah. I think major takeaway in my brain as far as like way forward, or just trying to think of, like you said, where do we go from here? I think doing what we can to try to get rid of some of the hyper individualism that's kind of in our culture, that's seeped into a lot of Christian expression. It's just sort of that me, myself, and I, and Jesus sort of is there with the ticket type of experience. Not really being part of a community, showing up to like maybe a church service here and there, looking for something for myself, whether it's entertainment or just a kind of a nice little lift, but not being there for like each other, being, that way of living life together in a way that lifts each other up is something I think is really missing for a lot of Christians. And it's supposed to be a major part of the experience, is that participation element. The other thing that was mentioned is, I think, this idea of like being a Christian, this idea of being saved, however you want to phrase it, making it so easy to the point of dead faith is another huge issue. So this, I guess, this word disciple is a huge one. You're trying to imitate a master. Thinking of like, I always think of like a kung fu disciple. Like you're trying to get like I just watched my kung fu master like tiptoe across tree tops and stuff. Like I need to figure out how to do that. How much training does it take, man? Yeah. As long as it remains that first idea, it's just me going to heaven, we're gonna see a lot of just dead Christianity.
Absolutely.
once it's heaven spilling out, now you've got a way forward and even just like a mental image of what I think is supposed to be happening, and we'll be in a better spot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep. That's also a lot of good stuff. And as we're nearing the 1 hour mark here, I will chime in with this. I think if we the people who see the most forward movement in what I would call discipleship or becoming like Jesus are the people who read the words of Jesus and his vision for what it means to be a person and who become, I guess, enraptured by it, who are inspired by it and they want to be like the kind of person he's describing.
Mhm.
A lot of these are like people really, really, really early or right at the beginning of their walk of faith. And they're just reading the words of Jesus
Yeah.
and they don't have anybody whispering any kind of orthodoxy, which is not to say that orthodoxy is bad, but sometimes the framework, if the framework is built on some incorrect assumptions, I think the framework can take the power right out of the words of Jesus by explaining them away into a theological, again, framework. But I think a lot of the people who read the words of Jesus and who are just blown away by his picture of what it means to be a human, and then who actually attempt to do the things that he said to do, I think that's what the church, I think that's what modern Christianity maybe is missing more than anything else, is just a love for the teaching, for the vision of Jesus, and then taking it seriously, not saying, well, he's telling us to do something that we can't actually do, or really it's all about just heaven, but just saying, this is this guy, here's how he lived and died and lived again, and here's his picture of the kind of man or woman or son or daughter that he wants you to be. I think that's really, really important. And is maybe
Yeah,
the answer.
absolutely. It really, what you're saying, Nate, really ties back to a term that Michael was using for me when he mentioned, a healthy expression of Christianity. Like, what's it look like when we do see healthy expressions, And I think that the more that we have that inspiration or we rediscover and recapture that inspiration that you're talking about, I think that's so true. I think that's, you can't fake your way into Christianity. You can't fake motivation. You have to, you have to install it. You have to be diligent. And so I think having that inspiration of seeing someone who is living a life that just makes sense, who is enduring through suffering and consequences, but it's so inspiring. I think that's such a strong point. And so that leads me with, you know, first of all, thank you everyone who's been listening to this. I think next time we're gonna have another very easy conversation, but I think, my mind really takes that next step and asks, well, what does it really look like to have those healthy expressions of Christianity? Those times, you heard the term killing with kindness, right? That's definitely biblical. That totally comes from the Bible. But what's it look like to kill with kindness? What's it look like to live out the Christian life in some maybe stressful circumstances versus maybe what someone who's not a Christian, you know? Another very
Yeah.
easy discussion.
Yeah. We'll take the easy approach again. Well, guys, listeners out there, thanks for joining us for this. As I said before, I think this is a conversation that could probably just have, 5 to 10 episodes doing a deep dive. But for now, I think that'll do. Michael, thanks for joining us, buddy. That
Yeah,
was a good
thanks,
time.
Mike.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
We
Yep.
love it.
Y'all out there, keep your fingers crossed that our boy can join us for a lot more of these, because he's got a lot of wisdom to share.
Amen.
I hope you guys join us next time as we do another deep dive and take another easy crack at this thing.
Thank you, everyone, again. Thank you, Michael and Nate. Hope everyone joins us in our next easy discussion when we figure out what it looks like to kill with kindness.
Take it easy. to